Chapter 11, Patient Assessment. The elements of patient assessment are presented in this section. Before you reach a patient, you will perform a scene size-up to determine scene safety and evaluate the nature of the call, the number of patients, and the need for additional resources. When the scene is safe, your first task is to find immediate care for any life threats as you perform the primary assessment. Next, you will perform the secondary assessment, during which you will obtain a patient history and perform a more detailed assessment. You will also measure vital signs and make use of appropriate monitoring devices. This section will detail the assessment of patients in a variety of situations, including medical and trauma emergencies. En route to the hospital, you will perform frequent and careful reassessment. Throughout the patient assessment, you will be working toward forming your EMT field diagnosis of the patient's condition, making use of critical thinking and decision-making skills. Finally, you will use the important skills of communication and documentation to assess documentation in assessment and throughout your patient care. Objectives. After reading this chapter, you should be able to 1. Define key terms introduced in this chapter. Explain the ongoing nature of scene size-up beyond the initial moments at the scene. Given a scene arrival scenario, list several examples of potential hazards for which the EMT should actively search. Describe considerations in establishing a danger zone at the scene of a vehicle collision. Recognize indications of possible crime scenes and the potential for violence. Use information from the scene size-up to make decisions about the use of standard precautions to protect against disease exposure. Use information from the scene size-up to determine the mechanism of injury and nature of the illness. Explain the importance of determining the number of patients and the need for additional resources in the scene size-up. Given a number of scenarios, perform a scene size-up including A. Recognizing potential dangers, B. Making decisions about body substance isolation, C. Determining the nature of the illness or mechanism of injury, D. Determining the number of patients, and E. Determining the need for additional resources. Scene size-up. Scene size-up is the first part of the patient assessment process. It begins as you approach the scene, surveying it to determine if there are any threats to your own safety or to the safety of your patients or bystanders, to determine the nature of the call, and to decide if you will need additional help. However, scene size-up is not confined to the first part of the assessment process. These considerations should continue throughout the call, since emergencies are dynamic, always changing events. You may find, for example, that patients, family members, or bystanders who are not a problem initially become increasingly hostile later in the call, or that vehicles or structures that seem stable suddenly shift and pose a danger. After your initial scene size-up, you will become more directly involved in patient assessment and care. However, it is a good idea to remember the key size-up elements throughout the call to prevent dangerous surprises later. You can obtain important information from just a brief survey of the scene. For example, you might see a downed electrical wire at the scene of a vehicle collision, a potential deadly situation for you as the EMT, your patient, and bystanders. Further observations of the scene are likely to reveal more important information about the mechanism of injury. For example, damage to the steering wheel or windshield would be a strong indicator of potential chest, head, or neck injury caused by a driver impact with those surfaces. A deployed airbag would cause you to assess for injuries airbags might cause, especially in an infant or child front seat passenger. Just as important as your observations will be the actions you take to obtain needed assistance and prevent further injury. For example, if there are 2 patients at a collision, you would request that a second ambulance be dispatched to the scene. More if you discovered that there were additional passengers. If there were also a downed wire at that scene which poses a danger of electrocution and fire, you would notify the fire department as well as the power company and the police department. In addition, you would take steps to keep bystanders clear of traffic, the collision, and the patients. Scene safety. The only predictable thing about emergencies is that they are often unpredictable and can pose many dangers if you are not careful. Before you arrive on the scene, the dispatcher may relay important information to you. A well-trained EMD, emergency medical dispatcher, uses a set of questions to determine information that may affect you directly. For example, if the caller tells the EMD of particular hazards, you could immediately call for additional specialized assistance. You will learn more about the questions an EMD asks in the EMS operations chapter. Often you will find a scene where there are police, firefighters, or even other ambulances already present. In a situation such as this, do not assume that the scene is safe or that others have taken care of any hazards. Always perform your own size up no matter who arrives first. Scan the scene hazards, infection control concerns, mechanisms of injury, and number of patients. The scene size up begins even before the ambulance comes to a stop. Observe the scene while you approach and again before you exit the vehicle. The following are scene size up considerations you should keep in mind when you approach a crash or hazardous material emergency. As you near the collision scene, look and listen for other emergency service units approaching from side streets. Look for signs of a collision-related power outage, such as darkened areas, which suggest that wires are down at the collision scene. Observe traffic flow. If there is no opposing traffic, suspect a blockade at the collision scene. Look for smoke in the direction of the collision scene, a sign that fire has resulted from the collision. When you are within sight of the scene, look for clues indicating escaped hazardous material, such as placards, a damaged truck, escaping liquids, fumes, or vapor clouds. If you see anything suspicious, stop the ambulance immediately and consult your hazardous materials reference book or hazardous materials team if one is available. Look for collision victims on or near the road. A person may have been thrown from a vehicle as it careened out of control, or an injured person may have walked away from the wreckage and collapsed on or near the roadway. Look for smoke not seen at a distance. Look for broken utility poles and downed wires. At night, direct the beam of a spotlight or flashlight on poles and wire spans as you approach the scene. Keep in mind that wires may be down several hundred feet from the crashed vehicles. Be alert for persons walking along the side of the road toward the collision scene. Curious onlookers are often oblivious to vehicles approaching from behind. Watch for the signals of police officers and other emergency service personnel. They may have information about hazards and the location of injured persons.